So when our oldest son was born, I remember one of the first things was holding him in the hospital and feeling like if I didn't hold him just right, he was going to break. You know, you have that kind of initial, like, you know, they tell you to hold the head up, and you felt like if you didn't, the head might pop off and roll down the floor of the hallway. Like it's just this fragile little, like, I don't know what to do, so we hold on tight. And then I just remember kind of at everything, paying attention, making sure that everything was okay, hovering around that baby. And Katie going and making, you know, listening in the night to make sure that he's breathing. We're constantly concerned that everything's okay. I remember teaching him to walk, and you just kind of walked around kind of behind them, making sure they don't ever fall or get hurt. And when they do get hurt, if something happens, we freak out. Like the response of us parents with number one tends to be, oh, are you okay? And then of course it turns into a whole deal. Then I remember when we had our second. And I remember, you know, I was a little less worried about the head popping off. I was a little less worried about, you know, the fragility of the child. And so it wasn't as big of a deal. I remember when we, you know, when our second one started walking, it was just kind of like, all right, you know, let's go and you'll be okay. We've seen it before. Go follow your brother around. I remember when we learned by the second one that if they fell down, we didn't have to freak out. In fact, we would fake it and be like, oh, everything's okay, everything's okay. Well, internally, sometimes we're like, what just happened? You know, this is terrible. But oh, you're okay, it's going to be okay. Because if we freaked out, they freaked out. Then we had the third. Anything goes with the third. You know, we held him, but like I threw him around, and you know, we weren't super concerned about anything from the very beginning. I remember when we were trying to get, you know, teaching him to walk with number three, it was just like put him down and go. Like go. Follow your brothers. Like it's fine. You're going to be okay. And while with the second one we had learned to fake it, you know, it's okay, you're going to be fine. With the third one we didn't even look up from what we were doing. When we heard him fall down, yeah, you're fine. You'll be okay. It's no problem. Parenting's kind of funny like that. We have this call as parents to protect our kids, to take care of them, to keep them safe. And at the same time, the whole point is for them to eventually take care of themselves, to not need us so much, to not require us hovering around them like helicopters, making sure that everything's okay. Today, as we look at the way that Jesus disappeared, we see a little bit of this parenting theme. Jesus over and over again had this bad habit of disappearing, and it was always seemed to be at the wrong times. And certainly sometimes in my life I feel like Jesus disappears, or at least I can't see him at some of the most difficult times too. And I have trouble figuring out why that is. But Jesus did it all the time. Though he traveled with his disciples pretty much constantly, he was surrounded by not just the 12, but all sorts of other people. He was always around people, except when every once in a while he would get away. He'd get away to pray, he'd get away to sleep, he'd get away to just be by himself. Every once in a while, he disappeared. 3 times we're going to look at it this morning that Jesus disappeared for a reason. The first one was read to you already by Cindy. And you remember that story? It's really the only story of Jesus' childhood that we have, which is where at 12 years old they go to Jerusalem with his family, and he's there, and his family leaves, and clearly it's a caravan. They're not like all in the car and not notice for a day that Jesus wasn't there. They've got family and they're traveling, and after a day they realize Jesus was not in the car. When I was a kid, we had an old green station wagon. And I remember one time we pulled up, this is before car seats and all that stuff, and so we pulled up to to the bank drive-through teller. And as we're sitting there, and my parents are talking to the teller, my brother climbed out the back window and up on top of the car. And we were young. And they're getting ready to drive away, and the teller is like, you have something on your car. My brother was up there. Now, Jesus didn't just disappear like that. They had a whole big group of people, and he wasn't there. So, they go traveling for a day. Imagine the fear of losing your son. You've been traveling for a day, and all of a sudden you realize he's not with us. You start asking around, asking the family, trying to figure out where he is. Takes a while, and you figure out he didn't come back with us. So now you have to turn around and go back a day of traveling to get back to Jerusalem. So they do that, they get there, and again, surely they're terrified that he's hurt, and also a little bit ready to kill him when they find him, right? So they get there, it takes them 3 days to find him after they get there. We're now 5 days in. We have not seen him and don't know where he is, and finally they find him at the temple. And his response is rough for a parent. Luke 2:48 says, when his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." He responded, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house? I'd have killed him." Jesus disappeared from his parents. Like, this is as a parent, this is the closest thing to saying Jesus was a sinner that he does when he disobeys his parents. But the reality is, he is obedient to his father. Why were you looking for me? Where do you think I was? Don't you know I needed to be in my father's house? I think about Mary and Joseph because I think of the responsibility as a parent that it is just to have your own kids and to take care of them. Imagine even more so losing the Son of God. That God sent angels multiple times to remind you is a big deal. And you realize you lost him at 12 years old. Imagine that fear. And then they come back and they find him and he isn't even concerned about what he did. About why he disappeared. But it reminds us who Jesus was. He knew where he belonged and who he belonged to. I had a seminary professor who used to tell us that he had 3 daughters. He said every time one of my daughters, especially in high school, every time one of my daughters would leave the house and go hang out with her friends or go to work or whatever, he said, I always turned to them and said, remember whose you are. And he said one time we had friends over and I said to my daughter as she was going out, remember whose you are. My friend said, don't you mean remember who you are? He said, no, I said remember whose you are. You belong to God and you are my child. Remember whose you are when you leave this house. Jesus knew. 12 years old, he knew where he needed to be. He knew whose he was, and he disappeared to go and be in his Father's house. Second story. Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves. Jesus tells them, let's get in the boat, let's cross over, then he goes down below and takes a nap. And all of a sudden, as Jesus is napping, his disciples see that a storm is coming. And you realize this had to be a pretty legitimate storm because these are mostly fishermen in the boat. So normal wind and waves are not going to bother them too much. But a squall comes up and they're starting to lose it. They realize their lives are in danger. And where is Jesus? The one person that maybe could do something about this. We've seen him heal people. We've seen him feed people. We've seen him do all sorts of stuff. And he's asleep in the boat. So they go to him and they ask him to save them. To come and to make it better. You know, I think Jesus several times in his ministry backs off from his disciples for a reason. I was telling the kids about training wheels. You know, we do that thing, we put those training wheels on, and it allows you to ride a bike. You can ride a bike all over the place. You can have a great time with training wheels. But the reality is, if you ever want to actually learn how to ride a bike, you have to take them off. You can't do it while they're on. It doesn't work. The crutch gets in the way. Same with my wheel. As I was trying to learn how to ride it, the training wheels kept me from being able to. So eventually I had to just take them off and go. And I fell and I got hurt and I bruised my legs up and I failed a bunch of times, but eventually it worked. Same as I've seen with my kids as they've learned to ride a bike after we took off the training wheels. You know, Jesus knew that eventually he was going to go. And yes, thankfully, he doesn't leave us alone. He sent his Holy Spirit to come and be within us. But physically, his disciples have been with him all this time. They've trusted the man to be there with them. And Jesus knows that where they are going, their faith must be better than that. So let me give you some chances. He goes and he sleeps in the boat. And when the storm comes, what do? What kind of faith do you have? And again, that's his response when they wake him up. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? The third story. Matthew 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get onto the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. And after dismissing them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So before Jesus stayed in Jerusalem and didn't go with his parents, then we saw Jesus asleep in the boat in the midst of a storm. This time he disappears. He sends his disciples on ahead and gets by himself. He gives us a picture that we really need that time sometimes. Now, I'm an extrovert, and I love being around people. I love to be surrounded by people all the time. But still, there are times that I've got to be alone with my Father in heaven. There are times that we need to get apart. And Jesus knew that, and over again, he would separate. He was not afraid to send them on and go off by himself so that he could spend time with his Father. So he does that. And then he decides, the boat is over there. I'm going to head to the boat. He begins to walk on water. And of course, imagine the image of a man on his way. And it's obviously windy. It's late. They're terrified until Jesus says, "Don't be afraid. It's me." I love Peter's response. Peter is an up and down character in the Bible, right? He is sometimes a great friend and a great follower of Jesus, certainly becomes a great apostle, but he's also cocky and brash and doesn't always do the right things. But in this case, I love it because everybody in the boat, the only one that mentions is Peter. And Peter says, Lord, let me come. Imagine the faith to be willing to step out of a boat onto what is liquid and assume it's going to hold me. I can't imagine that kind of faith. Even seeing Jesus do it. Jesus has done all sorts of stuff that Peter hasn't done. Peter hasn't fed the 5,000. Peter hasn't healed anybody at this point. Jesus has done all that, but that doesn't mean I can do it. But he has the faith to step out. He begins to walk, and he looks ahead, and he sees Jesus, and as he's walking towards Jesus, his faith and Jesus' power is allowing him. Until, of course, he sees everything else. He gets distracted, he gets afraid, and he falls in. Jesus comes, pulls him out as he yells, Lord, save me. Jesus says once again, you of little faith, why did you doubt? What do we learn when Jesus disappears? One, we learn that even as a child, Jesus knew whose he was. Do you? Do you realize whose you are? You belong to the creator of the universe. And when he calls, we go, just as Jesus did. Faith is about trusting in the Father no matter what, and following where he leads. Secondly, we learn from his encounter on the boat that there are going to be stormy times and it feels like Jesus is nowhere to be found. The reality is he is near. And so he doesn't leave us alone. He's actually here with us even when we don't know. There's nothing to fear. And on the water, as Jesus walks to his disciples, we learn two things. The value of time with God. Jesus valued that time away from his friends to nurture that relationship with his Father. And then we see from Peter our focus. The reality from Peter walking on water is with our focus on Christ, we have nothing to worry about because anything can happen. But when we turn away, we're in trouble. Jesus had a tendency to get away and disappear, and he always did so for a purpose. He did so to show them, to be an example for them of the need to take time with the Father. He did so to force them to think about how in the world are we going to do this when Jesus isn't here physically among us. He did it to prepare them, to take the training wheels off, to say, you need to be ready to serve. And you know what? They did. When Jesus ascended into heaven, his disciples became apostles. They became people who went and shared the gospel. And most of them were killed because of it. Jesus prepared them. It's a story of faith. Can we trust even when we do not see? Let's pray.